Okay, so having had a sort of overview of things last week, what we can do now is to start looking in detail at the various hurdles that you've got to cope with. And we're going to start with UCAT because, I mean, it is one of the most important of the hurdles, but it's also probably the one that we need to talk about most because it's the one where you're going to have to do a huge amount of preparation. And as I sort of hinted last week, all we can do in these lessons is sort of show you what the test is like, talk about how to approach questions, so that hopefully when you start really getting stuck into your preparation, you don't look at it and think, I've no idea what I'm meant to be doing here. That's the stage we're aiming to get past. But it won't mean that you're then prepared for the test, because the preparation comes from just doing endless practice, because it's a race against time. UCAT is a ridiculously fast-paced test, and the only way, like with most things in life, the only way you get quick at things is by just endlessly repeating them, so that it becomes something that you can do as a routine. And it will take practice, but let's make a start anyway and just introduce you to the test. So just to remind you that there's no escaping this. You can't do what you could do in the old days, which was to sort of select the ones that don't use UCAT, because they all use UCAT, whether it's for medicine or for dentistry. So that's something that you are going to have to deal with. And a reminder that it's not an exam in the conventional sense. It's a purely online test. And importantly, it's not organised through the college. So it's not like your other exams where they will, the college will organise your entry and stuff like that. You have to do all that yourself, but I'll make sure that you know when to do it and where the website is and that kind of stuff. So the test itself takes place at one of these test centres, and there's one in Hereford, and there are ones in various of the other towns around. So it's easy enough to find the centre, although as I'll show you in a minute, booking isn't necessarily quite as straightforward as you might hope. And you have these 4 sections, which we'll talk more about in a minute. So there's a bit of sort of fairly important information here. First of all, the booking opens, as it says, not till late in June. And I will remind you about this in the days leading up to it to make sure you don't miss it. You notice that it says that booking opens at 6 a.m. And I'm going to recommend to you to set your alarm clock and actually get up for 6 a.m. and book it straight away on that day. Because the problem is that an awful lot of people do UCAT around the country. I think it was something like 17,000 or something people did it last year. Maybe more than that, I can't remember, but loads and loads of people. Plus, these test centres don't just obviously cater for UCAT, they cater for lots of other online tests like driving theory tests, for example, and so they get booked up. And so we have had people who've either had to book tests on a date when they really didn't want to do it, or have had to go a long way away, to Birmingham or somewhere to do the test because it got booked up locally. So I'm going to suggest that you actually get in there early and get it booked. The test window, as it says, is from sort of mid-July to nearly the end of September. But I think there's very much a kind of optimum period for doing it. It's because it's going to take lots of practice. You don't want to do it too early because you just won't be ready. So I'm going to suggest that unless your summer is absolutely so booked up that you haven't got any choice, that you don't do it before sort of late August at the earliest, to give yourself several weeks of intense preparation, or indeed early September. Ideally do it before you come back to college, although obviously you don't have to. You'll have been back in college for a couple of weeks by then. But the beginning of term in college is really busy because you're going to have to get your UCAS application together. Plus there are likely to be, tests in various subjects and things like that to be preparing for. So you don't really want to have UCAT to deal with as well. So I think the real window for you ought to be from sort of late August to the beginning of September up until when college starts. It costs money, unfortunately, so £70 in general for people. There is an exemption for people who are experiencing financial hardship for one reason or another. And it's important that they're very good about that. So long as you provide the evidence, it just happens automatically. You don't have to sort of go through endless arguments and stuff like that. And if you go on to the UCAT website, they list the various criteria they use. So they have various bits of evidence that you can produce to say that you think you should be eligible for this bursary. And it's things like free school meals, or if you're in receipt of the college bursary, that kind of thing. So don't miss out on that if you think you might be applicable. The other advantage of it, actually, quite apart from saving you £70, is that if you're going to ask universities for special consideration, so like, for example, a contextual offer that might be lower than the normal offer, or sometimes an increased chance of getting an interview, some of them use the UCAT bursary as one of the bits of evidence you can produce to back up your case. So again, it has that sort of extra reason that it's worth doing for a few universities. It's important to note that you can only do it once in a given year. So you're not going to be faced with sort of multiple lots of £70 if it doesn't work out well the first time. If it doesn't work out well the first time, unfortunately, that's it for that year. You can't try again until next year. So that may be a good thing financially, but it means that you've got to make sure you're really well prepared for that first shot. The other thing that's incredibly important to notice is that extra time is available if you qualify for it. And because UCAT is more than anything else a race against time, you know, the questions are mostly not that hard. It's just you have to answer them so fast. So having 25% more time makes a huge difference to your chances of getting a decent score. So if you have already been approved for extra time for your A-levels, all we need to do is to get learning support to sign a letter, which we can then send on to UCAT to confirm that, and you should then automatically get the 25% extra time. If you're at that stage where it hasn't really been an issue for you, but you're beginning perhaps to wonder whether you ought to have extra time, and this happens a lot in this college, because what tends to happen is that if you're quite bright at secondary school, they don't really, you know, learning support's not interested in you because they've obviously got people with huge learning support needs that they are going to be focused on. And so a lot of people just escape their notice who really ought to have had extra time. So if you find, for example, that you're always running out of time in tests, or that you're just having to rush your work so much that you make endless mistakes that you wouldn't have made if you'd just been able to slow down a little bit, then it's worth considering that that might mean that you just have slow writing speed or slow reading speed or slow processing speed, and any of these things could qualify you for extra time. So if you think that might be an issue, just tell one of your teachers that you think that, and they will refer you to learning support. And they can just then do an assessment, and they might say, no, you're fine. Well, okay, you haven't lost anything. But if you do qualify, it could make a huge difference. But it takes a bit of time because they'll have to give you tests and all this kind of stuff. So do it now. Do it straight after half term if you think you just possibly might qualify for extra time. Okay, so we looked at this last time, so I won't go through it again in detail, but it's just to remind you that what UCAT is mainly used for is cutting down the numbers, because they don't want to interview everyone who applies. They haven't got the time to do that, so they want to get rid of, half the applications or more before they even see you for interview, and UCAT is the main way they do that. So it's really important. And in medicine, the numbers of applicants, these were 2022 data, the number of applicants did drop a little bit in sort of 23, 24, so that it got a little bit easier than those figures would suggest, but they were up by 10% again this year. So it's not going to be easy. So it may not be quite as bad as, getting rid of 2/3 of the applicants, as those figures suggest, but it's going to get rid of a significant number. So you need to do well at it. And for dentistry, dentistry is getting more and more popular. So the UCAT requirements are creeping up year on year. So again, it's going to be really important to do well. Okay, so those are the 4 tests that we're going to talk about. So verbal reasoning is where you have a passage of text and then you have to answer a bunch of questions on it, and we'll have a look at that one further in a little while today. Decision making is the one that initially takes the most getting used to, because it's sort of logical puzzles, and if you haven't seen puzzles like them before, they can seem intimidating, but actually that's usually the one that people find easiest in the end, because once you've got used to the format of the puzzles, they're quite predictable and straightforward. Quantitative reasoning is simple maths questions, not algebra or anything like that. It's the kind of maths that you learnt when you were 12 or something, but again, you've got to be quick and you've got to be accurate with it. And those 3 tests are all scored numerically. As you can see there, don't worry about these numbers. They have this bizarre scoring system which is completely impenetrable, but basically it still amounts to the fact that the more you get right, the higher the score. And what most universities do is just add up your total score from those 3 sections and say, right, this is your total, and they will, in some cases, just rank people according to that total from those top 3 sections. The bottom one is different, because situational judgment is where they will give you a scenario and then ask you questions like, how should you respond in this situation, or what would be the most appropriate way to act if this situation happened when you were around. So it's basically testing your sort of moral compass, if you like. And because it's very subjective, they don't score it numerically. But what they do is put you in a band, which is basically based on how often you agree with what they think. So if you agree with them most of the time, you get in band 1. If you disagree with them most of the time, you get put in band 4. And some universities score you according to what band you get put in and just add it to your score from the cognitive sections. But some universities in fact, a lot of universities just have a rule that says, well, if you get band 1, 2, or 3, we don't care. We're happy with that. But if you get band 4, that means you're probably a psychopath, so we don't want you. And therefore, they throw your application out straight away. So situational judgment is mainly a case of avoiding band 4. So we'll talk about that in a later session as well. Yeah, okay, so that just kind of summarizes what we just said. So let's start then with verbal reasoning, which is the first section. So on the face of it, it looks like the easiest section, because you've all done stuff like this before. It's like GCSE English, where they give you a passage of text and then you have to do a bunch of questions based on what it says in the passage. But although it feels like the easiest one, actually, historically, every single year, it's the one that has the lowest average score. And that's because you just have to do it ludicrously fast. So when we'll look at some questions this morning, and when we just look at them without any time pressure, you'll hopefully think, yeah, that's not too bad. There are a few little things you have to get used to, pitfalls that you've got to make sure you don't fall for. But generally speaking, the questions are pretty straightforward until you start doing it against the clock, and then you realize that it's really quite challenging. And so practice is going to be the only way. So the way it works is you get 11 different passages of text that you're going to have to read, and each of them has 4 questions attached to it. And in total, you have 22 minutes. So that means on average, you'll have 30 seconds per question. But obviously, that's an oversimplification, because what will generally happen with each passage is that it'll take you quite a long time to answer the first one, because you're still working out what's in the passage, and then you get quicker as you go through subsequent questions. But the big danger is that they don't sort of say, hang on, you spent too much time on this one, you better move on to the next one. They leave that entirely up to you. So you could spend the first 10 minutes puzzling over the first question, and maybe then get it right, but then you have no chance of getting a decent score, because you're not going to be able to get through half the test. So it's practicing discipline, making sure you don't get bogged down, guessing and moving on when you need to. That's really important. But 30 seconds per question, as you'll see when we look at real examples, is quite challenging. Okay, so we'll look at two types of question. The first one is where you have a series of statements based on the passage, and for each one you have to say whether it's true or it's false, or whether you can't tell from the passage. It's really important that you realize that it's supposed to be only based on what's in the passage, not on what any knowledge that you might have independently of what's written there. And that's why sometimes people, when they should say can't tell, they say true or they say false, because they think, well, I know that, so I know it's true, so I'll say true. But if it's not stated explicitly in the passage, then you have to say can't tell. So that's kind of important to get used to. The other kind of question, they ask sort of more general questions like which of the following is true, or which of the following is the author most likely to agree with, or which of these best states the author's view, stuff like that. So they call them free text responses. And we'll look at some examples of those as well. Okay, so we'll start with this one. So this is a passage about rugby, and the important thing is you're going to get passages about all kinds of stuff. You don't ever have to know anything about the subject matter. They just do it to make you read things that have a bit of jargon, a bit of technical language in them, but you don't have to really understand what that technical language means. Okay, so read that and then have a think about what you think the answers would be for the three questions at the bottom. Okay, so what about the first one there then? So Finn Russell plays at number 10 for Scotland. Anybody want to go out on a limb and say true or false or can't tell for that one? Okay, see what I think. So that's the evidence. So it talks about Finn Russell there as a would-be creative magician, and then in a later sentence it talks about gliding, hip swaying, lightweight number 10s being mostly a thing of the past. But it's not clear that the two things are directly related. So you might suspect that he plays at number 10, but you can't tell directly from that. So you're absolutely right. Can't tell is the right answer. But you can see that's one of the more difficult ones. I mean, it's not difficult, but you had to read it quite carefully, because you can see there is a reference to Finn Russell and there is a reference to people playing at number 10. And you had to read it carefully and make sure that it wasn't directly saying, yes, he's one of those number 10s, but it doesn't say that. So that's right. That's a can't tell. And again, if you happen to follow rugby and he plays at number 10, don't fall for that one and put true, because you can't tell from the passage. Okay, second one then. Clive Rowlands used to be involved with preparing the Welsh national team for matches. An easier one. You want to go for that one? Yeah, that one is true. because, as it says there, he was the former Wales coach. So obviously that's what coaches do. So that's true. And then people playing internationals at number 10 are now generally lighter and more agile than they used to be. What do you think about that one? I think you probably can tell, but you have to work it out. So if you have a look at the evidence, it says lightweight number 10, so that's obviously the relevant sentence, and it says consequently have mostly gone the same way as prog rock and old-fashioned sweet shops. So you might think, well, I don't actually know anything about prog rock or old-fashioned sweet shops, so I don't really know what that sentence means. And that is the trouble with these passages that they pick, that they're not usually intended for general consumption. They're intended for people who have a particular interest in whatever it is. So, they'll make assumptions about their audience. In this case, it's probably aimed largely at middle-aged men that, watch rugby. And so they would probably know that prog rock and old-fashioned sweet shops are things you don't really see anymore. But if you didn't know that, it doesn't matter, because if you go on to the next sentence, it says largely gone too. In other words, it says, oh, those things have gone because these days of fast running number 10s have also gone. So I think that statement sort of does more or less definitively say that lightweight number 10s have largely disappeared, and therefore it's not true to say that people are lighter and more agile than they used to be. So you can see that the questions are not phenomenally difficult, but they're not trivial either. You have to read the sentences and think about what they mean. You get a few where it more or less answers it in the right words, but mostly you have to think a little bit about what they mean, and all of that takes time. And sometimes, as with that one, if you just stopped reading at the end of that sentence, you might think, I have no idea what that means, and you had to then read the next sentence to figure out what it means. Okay, so that's an example of the first kind of question. Let's have a look at the other kind. So this time it's about a French chemist in the 18th century. And you can see at the bottom there are 4 statements, and you just have to decide which one is not true. Okay, so see what you think of that one. Okay, so any offers for that one? Which one is not true? It is indeed B. Well done. Yeah. Okay. So if we just go through those quickly. First one, Lavoisier lived more than half a century. So you just have to look for the dates. And you can see he lived from August 1743 to May 1794. So just less than 51 years, but therefore more than 50 years. So that one is true. B, he was a prolific discoverer of chemical elements. Well, it actually says right in the very first line, Lavoisier discovered no new substances. So there you go, that one is definitely true. Now, if this was in a class exercise, what you would then do probably is you go on and look at C and D and just double check that those are true to make sure that you correctly pinpointed the one. But you don't have time to do that. So again, the game here is that as soon, if there's just one that isn't true, as soon as you've spotted it, you just ignore the rest of the question and move on. So you've got to try and cut corners wherever you can to get through the questions in time. Okay, so those are just examples of the kinds of thing that you may have to do. So what we'll do now is to look at a couple more examples, but this time we'll do them on paper. Find the bits of paper. So on here, this is a bit more like the real thing because instead of just having one question like those examples had, each passage has 4 questions. So I'll bring these round, and the second passage is on the back. So can I say, don't turn it over yet, just look at the first one and think about what the answers would be to that one. And we won't do that one strictly against the clock, but then we'll do the second one at that 30 seconds per question thing, just to give you a feeling for how pushed for time you're going to be. Okay, so don't turn it over, but you can start looking at the first one straight away. But we'll do the second one in a minute. Okay, so you should be looking at question 1, hopefully, which is about the Merthyr riots. So let's see what you think about that. You can chat amongst yourselves about these ones if you want, and then we'll do the other ones individually in a second. I'll just give you another minute or so, but we would have actually have run out of time long ago. So okay, so let's see what we make of those. Okay, so we're going to do this by voting on what you think is the right answer, and we're going to use the Australian voting system, which means that if you fail to vote, there's a $20 fine each time. Okay, so you have to vote for one thing each time. So, which of the following can be deduced from the passage? So, how many people think A? No. B? No. C? No. D? Okay, some tentative ones, but yes, I think everybody's got the right one there, which is good. Yeah, so he did indeed, because you just have to look at the dates for that one. So 2nd of June, the riot starts, and he's executed on the 13th of August, which is obviously just a few weeks later. So yeah, that's the right one for that one. Anybody tempted initially by any of the other ones? Yeah, I mean that's good, because I mean they're all, you know, they've all got sort of grains of truth in there, but not so. Richard Lewis did have an alternative name, as it says there, but it doesn't say that that was because he used it to escape justice, so it's not that one. William Crawshay is mentioned, but it doesn't tell us anything about his views on the Reform Bill. And you might think, oh well, he owned the ironworks, surely he'd be opposed to reform, but again, it doesn't say it, so you can't say that. And Lord Melbourne was convinced of Richard Lewis' guilt. Well, clearly not, because he just wanted him hanged as a warning to others, regardless of whether he was guilty or not. So great, everybody got that one right. So number 2, again, votes for A. No, B. 1 for B. C. U for C, and D. Yes, C is the right answer there. So if we just go through those, participants in the riot were seeking the overthrow of the government. Well, it says that it was independent political action, but political action doesn't necessarily mean overthrowing the government. It just means wanting to change what the government does. So that's not right. Soldiers were opposed to the rights of working people. Well, soldiers were used to suppress the rights of working people, but that doesn't mean that the soldiers themselves, I mean, they were just doing what they were told, you know, they were just following orders, as they say. So you can't know what they actually thought. Lord Melbourne insisted on Richard Lewis' execution was politically motivated. You can see now why that one was easier to spot, having done the previous one. Because if in question 1 you'd been thinking about C and said, was Lord Melbourne convinced of Richard Lewis' guilt? In the course of acting that one, you'd have the information to hand. And so when you get to this one, you think, oh yeah, that's true, because that sentence says that he wanted him hanged because he wanted to suppress the rise of a working class movement in Wales, not because he was interested in whether he was guilty or not. So that was the right answer. And the establishment, it says lots of the establishment wrote to the judge asking him to commute the sentence, but the judge did what Lord Melbourne said. So, okay, third one. Again, you've got to read the question carefully here. So it says, using the information, the following statements are correct except for one of them. So you're spotting the one that isn't correct. And again, when you're rushing, the danger is you misread the sentence and think you spotted the one that is correct. So which one is not correct? So again, let's vote on that one. So A, B, and then C and D. Yeah, so that was pretty easy one because it's right there at the end that says he was executed by hanging, so clearly not by firing squad. So B was the one that wasn't correct there. So again, you can see some questions are just easier than others. So that idea of 30 seconds per question is just an average. Some of them are going to be quicker than that, and that will give you a little bit more time to do some of the ones that take a bit more thinking about. And then finally, which of the following would be the best description of Merthyr in 1831? Now, some of you might have been to Merthyr and know that it's not best described as having a flat landscape. But again, remember, that's irrelevant. Any knowledge that you have to suppress, because this passage could come from anywhere. It could be taken from, a report by someone who has no knowledge of Merthyr and is just making it up. So you have to go with what's in the text, not with what you know. But it's clearly not A, because it talks about the hills above the town. So that's not the case. B, what do we think about B? Yeah, so B is right because it says over 11,000 of the people of Merthyr. So obviously there were more than 11,000 of them. So that's correct. Okay, so on the whole, the questions were not terribly difficult, but you had a lot of time to actually do them. So what we'll do in a second, and don't turn your page over yet, but in a second I'll just tell you to turn over, and then I'll give you 2 minutes, see if you can get all 4 questions done in 2 minutes, starting now. And stop. Okay, so how many people managed to get all 4 done? 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so you see the point then that that you just have to get quicker than you think is reasonable in order to do well at these things, and that's going to be your main task. So that's hopefully the main lesson from this morning. That it's not the difficulty of the questions; it's finding a way to do it quickly enough. People vary in their approaches. Most people will do as I think most of you did, just looking around, which is to sort of read through the passage first before you look at any of the questions, and that's what I tend to do. But some people say, oh, you should look at the questions first so that you can try and spot the answers as you go through. But unless you're capable of keeping an awful lot of information in your head, the idea of keeping those questions in your mind and taking on board all the stuff that's in the passage is kind of challenging. So I think probably you do have to read it first, but just as fast as you can. Okay, so I'll give you a couple more minutes just to finish off, and then we'll go through the answers to those. Okay, so let's just go through those then. So first one, which of the following is true based on the information in the passage? So if we go through, A says production of cast iron largely ended when you could make malleable iron, and it talks about cast iron was the original thing, and then malleable iron came in the late 1700s. And it talks about how great malleable iron was for some purposes, but it doesn't say production of cast iron stopped. It just says, you know, for things where you needed the iron to be flexible, then you would use that instead. But there were lots of applications, as of course there still are today, for cast iron, you know, in making railings and that kind of stuff. So that's not right. Puddlers often had ill health. That was the right answer. So B, if you got that one. And it says that at the end of the second paragraph. Work was extremely dangerous, and they mostly died or were forced by injuries and poor health to give up by the age of 40. So that was right. And again, at that point, I think that's clearly enough the right answer that you would skip even looking at C and D and you'd move on to the next one. But if you do check them, you can see that it's right, that it says that it was a highly skilled job, and it also says that the manufacturers could make their own reputations based on how skilled the puddlers were. So obviously it was in their interests as well as the individuals to make sure that they were well trained. And the impurity content of steel, it doesn't say, it just says steel came along and displaced malleable iron, but it doesn't talk about what the actual chemical difference is. So B was the right one for that one. Second question, which of the following can be inferred from the passage? When it says inferred, it basically just means which of the following is right. I mean, it's just a different way of saying the same thing. They would say that it's more of a hint that you kind of have to think about what the passage is telling you rather than look for the actual words. But in practice, I think the wording's almost interchangeable with the first one. So iron should be as pure as possible. Well, no, because it depends on the application, because it makes it more malleable, but it also makes it much weaker. So it would only be for certain specialist applications that would be true. Puddlers were highly paid. Again, it doesn't say that. It just says, oh, sorry, I'm answering the same question again, am I? No, yeah, so I've answering the same question twice, just ignore that bit. Right, third question. Why did Henry Cort not become a rich man? What did we think about that one? Yeah, that's right, because it says in that last paragraph that when they implemented the method in South Wales, they modified it slightly, and Cort obviously didn't have very good lawyers because they managed to just make it sufficiently different that it wasn't covered by his patent, and so he didn't make any money out of it. So B was the right answer for that one. And then the last one, again, you have to think about this because there's obviously no reference specifically to any of these structures, but given what it tells you about malleable iron, which is the one that you think it would be particularly good for? Yeah, because bridges obviously have to flex in the wind and when the temperature changes and that kind of stuff. And so it's the fact that it's a flexible structure. So that was right. Okay, excellent. So I think that was a harder one than the one on the other side. And that was sort of deliberate on my part because I just wanted to make sure you got the point that it's hard to get the questions done in the time. And so although this is probably at the harder end of the range of questions you get, it's not outside that range. So it's really important that you just get a huge amount of practice done to make sure you're up to speed with all of that. So as I said last week, but what that doesn't mean is that I think you now need to go home and say, right, I've got to start really, really practicing for UCAT now, because you can't really afford to do that because your priority's got to be your A-levels. Because UCAT's totally pointless if you don't get your 3 A's at the end of the day, because you might get an offer of a place, but then you won't be able to take up the place if you don't get the 3 A's. So the priority at the moment is just keeping your eye on the ball as far as your subjects are concerned. Once the mock exams are out the way in the summer, things ease off a bit, then is the time to really get stuck in and just do as much practice as you can. Concentrating on getting the questions right, obviously there is an extent to which you have to learn to spot the traps, maybe develop your approach as to whether you just read the passage first or whether you start thinking about the questions straight away. But mostly it's about just practicing and building up your reading speed. And I think for most people, the only way to do that is just by doing lots of it. So one thing you can do now is just whenever you've got to read something or you want to read something because it's interesting to you, then practice reading it fast and just see how quickly you can read it and then feel, yeah, I did understand what that was saying at the end. And you can, go back and check that you didn't miss anything. So you can start doing that, and I think that really helps. Because most of the time when we have things to read, that's not what the most important thing is. Mostly it's about making sure you read it carefully and have got all the details on board. So it's just subtly changing that approach, that you can't afford to miss lots of stuff, but you can learn to read it faster. So maybe start trying to do that just on anything you fancy reading, or possibly things related to your college work. The other thing which I'll mention, although I can't necessarily provide you any evidence that this works, but I mean, there are people who do speed reading sort of in competitions and things like that. And what they say is that what you have to do is suppress this, what they call internal vocalization. So what that means is, I don't know what your experience is, but when I'm reading something, there's kind of a voice inside my head that's kind of reading it out to me. Does that make sense to you? And what they say is you can learn to do without that voice, and you can learn to process the information in your brain without vocalizing it. And they claim that massively speeds up your reading speed. I don't know how easy it is to do that or how effective it is, but certainly that's what a lot of these people claim that teach speed reading. So you could try that. If you can sense that voice speaking in your head, just see if you can learn to read without it, and see if that speeds things up for you. Okay, so what we'll do next week is to start looking at some of the other